Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yakov Shamash. I'm the Dean of the College of Engineering and Applied Sciences, and I'm also the Vice President for Economic Development. And I'm delighted to be here today to welcome our speaker. But first of all, I'd like to thank Alex. Where is Alex? Alex Orlov for arranging for the speaker to come here. Thank you very much, Alex. It's going to be a very entertaining lecture, I think. No slides, okay? No PowerPoints. This is just by accident. So Professor Daniel Esty is the Hillhouse professor at Yale University with appointments in both the environment and law schools. He also serves as the director of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy and serves on the board of the Center for Business and the Environment at Yale, which he founded in 2006. Professor Esty is the author and/or editor of 10 books and dozens of articles on environmental protection, energy, and sustainability, and their connections to policy, corporate strategy, competitiveness, trade, and economic success. His prize-winning volume, Green to Gold: How Smart Companies Use Environmental Strategy to Innovate, Create Value, and Build Competitive Advantage, has recently been named the top-selling green business book of the past decade. That's quite an accomplishment. From 2011 to early 2014, Professor Esty served as Commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, where he earned a reputation for bringing fresh thinking to both energy and environmental policymaking, including such innovations as the launch of Connecticut's first in the nation green bank, which we have copied now in New York State, and lean restructuring of all of Connecticut's environmental permitting programs to make the state's regulatory framework lighter, faster, and more efficient and effective. Prior to taking up his Yale professorship in 1994, he served in a variety of senior positions at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and was a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming Don Esty.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Thank you, Mr. Dean. Thank you, Professor Orlov, for organizing my visit. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy lives, particularly here as the semester draws to a close, to be part of what I hope will be a conversation. And I will start us off with 30 or 40 minutes of thoughts, but then I really do want to get into some kind of a dialogue and go back and forth, because I think we are at an auspicious moment from a point of view of the planet's future. Auspicious in part because a new Congress has just been elected, one that I think looks, from a point of view of the environment, to present some challenges. A auspicious moment because the UN Secretary General convened in September a climate change summit meeting in New York, hoping to mobilize leaders across the world to launch a new climate change agreement a year from now at a conference of the parties to the Climate Change Framework Agreement that will be held in Paris. Auspicious as well because here at Stony Brook, the Brookhaven Lab contract has been renewed. So thank you all again for being here, but I really want to talk about what I think is a crisis in environmental protection, a crisis that requires us to reframe how we address energy and environment issues. And really, and this is the summary slide and the only one that you heard we're going to have, that requires us to shift gears from a focus on environmental protection, which has served us well for 50 years, as we think about how we've gotten to where we are in the protection of our land, our air, our water, and the planetary resources like the atmosphere. But I think environmental protection now needs to give way to a broader framework that increasingly is talked about as sustainability. And I want to introduce to you some thoughts on what that transition needs to look like and how we are going to move from 20th century environmental protection to 21st century sustainability. So I think we start by recognizing that we owe a great debt of thanks to the political leaders the environmental leaders, the advocacy groups who launched us on the current trajectory. The work done in the late 1960s into the 70s, the passage of a series of path-breaking environmental laws, the Clean Air Act of 1970, the Clean Water Act of 1972, and a whole series of acts that helped us to begin to get our arms around and regulate chemicals and toxics and a variety of other issues, including in later eras, the release of chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere that was breaking down the ozone layer, the Montreal Protocol, and the Framework Convention on Climate Change that was signed, negotiated, and then signed in 1992 that is up for re-examination over the next year. So there has been a lot done, but I am doubtful that that same path will carry us forward as well as it has served over the past several decades or 50 years, in fact. So I want to talk about what we need to do to prepare for renewed momentum. And I want to talk to you about some elements of what I think is required. And notably this, I think the structure of law, which those of us in the business call command and control regulation, where the government dictates specific outcomes, a technology to buy in many cases, the best available technology is the term of art, or a specific emissions limit, that structure of command and control government mandates has gotten us going, but I think is not likely to get us where we need to go in the future. We are going to need to do more to harness economic incentives and market mechanisms and reframe how it is we guide behavior towards sustainability. And that concept, by the way, has a number of elements. I think the work in the 1980s by the Brundtland Commission does a pretty good job of telling us that the core elements of sustainability would be a management of our economic future in ways that promote growth and help lift people up, but in a manner that does not compromise the future generations' opportunities for the same. So it's got a series of elements to it that I think are now very important. Attention to long-term trajectories, the integration of issues, the recognition that there does need to be economic growth and that poverty is one of the most serious causes of environmental degradation, largely because people who are very poor make short-term choices that often compromise the environment. So I think we do have a framing concept for the 21st century in sustainability, but we have not yet worked out the action plan around it. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I think there is also, and this is why I say we have a crisis of environmental protection, there is an emerging backlash against the current approach to environmental protection. We saw it some in the election process over the last few months leading up to the early November election. We saw it even more sharply in the presidential election of 2012, where there were a number of candidates, particularly in the Republican primaries, who outright denounced the Environmental Protection Agency and the current structure of environmental regulation in America. And I think for those who are in the environmental arena, there was some degree of shock that you could get such a broad-based assault on what is a much revered structure of environmental protection efforts, including these laws that were adopted over 40 or 50 years and seem to be doing a pretty good job of improving the quality of our air and our water. But I think there is a lesson that needs to be listened to. And I think that lesson suggests that we can be more focused, more effective in our environmental regulation. And you heard the dean in the introduction say my mantra, which is a lighter regulatory framework that does not lower standards. And I think the prospect that what was first thought about 50 years ago could still be optimal today is almost unimaginable. We live in a world that's completely transformed, and it should not be a surprise that we now need to recast our model of environmental protection around this more integrated concept of sustainability. In fact, if I had to say a single word that is critical in my mind to the future of the environment and the planet, it is innovation. I think we need an innovation-centered approach to environmental protection and energy, and I'm going to talk about why those two are mirror images of each other and need to be addressed as a unified package. But I think an innovation focus is what is fundamental. And I want to talk a little bit about the backdrop against which this recasting of environmental protection needs to take place. Because I think changed circumstances define what our opportunities going forward look like. And I would argue that we have seen over the 40 or 50 years that the environmental framework of our current moment has developed a quite significant set of shifts in fundamental groundwork on which any program of environmental protection or future sustainability has to build. And let me highlight some of these mega trends, as I call them, that I think are giving us a signal that new directions are required, a new approach, a new sustainability model is needed. First is a recognition of the limits of government. So 50 years ago, we were in the throes of the Great Society. The ambition for government solutions to societal problems was almost unlimited. I can see some in this room remember those days. Others of you do not. It is hard today, in the era of limited government that we live in, to imagine the hope and ambition around government solutions that existed in the 1960s. It is completely transformed. I believe today we are in an era of limited government, not only expectations, but of resources. And that requires us in very important ways to rethink where the action to give us the solutions to these problems we face is going to come from, and not to jump too far ahead, because you've already heard that I spent a lot of my career working at the business, energy, and environment interface. I think the fundamental shift for the 21st century is that the critical point of leverage for change will be the business world and not government. So that's the starting point. Now, having said that that's critical, part of this is because the government has limited budgets and is in, I think, a perpetual state of budget crisis at this point. So the hope that we're going to get vast new investments of resources to take on problems like the challenge of clean energy, which is necessary to be addressed to solve climate change, just doesn't seem to be happening. Third, I think we live in an era of economic stagnation. And this is not, in my mind, simply a question of the downturn of 2008, 2009. We are seeing a structural change as the framework of the global economy shifts. And the economic strength that the United States had coming out of the Second World War that persisted through the 60s and into the 70s will not be the norm going forward. We're in a much more complicated, diverse, and spread world of economic opportunity. So I think there is in the United States a growing economic growth imperative that climate change efforts and environmental efforts and sustainability as a concept does not want to get crosswise with. Because the prospect of achieving success on our environmental agenda, on our planetary protection program, is going to be much greater if we are running with, not against, the tide that calls for an uplifting of the middle class and new economic growth prospects for working people. Fourth, we do live in a world that's urbanizing. The world of environmental protection that we designed 50 years ago had a big emphasis on conservation and on issues that relate to open space and open places. I think the agenda increasingly is going to be around how we manage cities on an integrated basis, not just energy and environment, but transportation, design, architecture, infrastructure, all as part of a package that needs to be managed for sustainability. Fifth is population. The population is continuing to grow, although in differential ways. Much faster growth in Asia, and frankly, pretty rapid growth in the United States compared to Europe. But population pressures remain part of the story that has to be thought about. I think we're also seeing the limits of natural resource availability in some critical categories. And I'm thinking in particular of things like rare earths, the fundamental materials that go into things like our cell phones or electronic devices. And I think there is a growing recognition we have to recast how those materials are managed, with a lot of talk now about a circular economy. I think we also have just begun to tap one of the critical mega trends of the last couple of decades in the environmental arena, and that's the ability to bring to bear information technology as a solutions provider to the sustainability challenges. And I say that with some surprise because I think of environmental types as eager to embrace the future, as open to change. But I would also tell you that it's my observation that the environmental arena is curiously unaffected by information technology breakthroughs and the digital revolution. Almost every other part of society has been more fully transformed. Nobody manages a baseball team today the way they did 20 years ago. They don't even think batting average matters anymore. It's on-base percentage. But very clearly, the Moneyball world of baseball, where we watch statistics and manage with a very fine-tuned focus on data, and lots of it, has transformed how we do sports in every level. It's transformed how we do marketing in the business world. It's transformed how hospitals make judgments about patient care. And yet I would argue that the environmental arena has been less transformed by the availability of data at low cost and with great capacity to detect signal from noise than almost any other part of society. And this is why I do highlight the Brookhaven Lab opportunity here as something that puts Stony Brook in the forefront of one of these critical transformational elements that I think define the opportunity set for the 21st century. And I think it goes beyond simply bringing to bear data. It allows us to do things quite differently than we have done them in the 20th century. Much of the 20th century was framed by the complexity and cost of setting out the regulatory targets, the environmental goals that we're aiming at. So we did a lot of things on a generalized, overarching basis because it was too challenging, too complicated. From an economics point of view, the transaction costs were too high for particularization. But that's what computers are good at. We can now tailor answers to specific circumstances rather than having a general approach to the country as a whole. And let me just give you one example. Some of us were talking earlier about differential rainfall across parts of the country. I was complaining, to be honest, about the waterless urinals in our LEED Platinum environment school at Yale. I say here in the Northeast, we have lots of rain. Let's use low-flow toilets, not no-flow toilets. But the logic here is that what is optimal from a sanitation point of view in the Northeast would be different in the Southwest, where water issues are critical. And today, we need not have a single standard. We can have a water standard for the desert and a different one for the rainy Northeast. And that, by the way, not only goes to sanitation, it goes to the kind of landfills you would have. You need to have a lined landfill in the Northeast so you're not leaching chemicals and other bad stuff into the local water supplies. That might not be required in Arizona. Today, we should be able to do, with the kind of refined analytic frameworks we can bring to bear, much more particularized analysis, much more individual tailoring of standards to circumstances. I think we're also going to see a dramatic transformation due to the internet and what I like to call the democratization of knowledge. There are many, many more people who are near or at the cutting edge of a lot of fields today because they can get access to the best information over the internet. You don't have to be at a world-class research university to be part of the conversation about how we're going to advance our progress on any number of these issues. So millions of people across the world are now potential participants in the dialogue around the science, engineering, technology development questions that are going to reestablish the possibility frontier for the 21st century. We also are going to have a much more transparent world. We have a world where cell phones and therefore cameras are ubiquitous, and that means there's lots of capacity to crowdsource some of the data that we need to manage. And again, we have not yet really taken advantage of that. But I do believe this transformation of the digital revolution into the environmental arena, or the marrying of information technology and the possibilities it presents to our environment and sustainability challenges, is a huge opportunity. Another challenge, another part of the mega trends that are the backdrop for this 21st century approach to sustainability, is globalization. We have an economy that is increasingly integrated, not just with Canada and Mexico, or not with only with our traditional trade partners in Europe, but with lots of countries all over the world, particularly with the production platforms of Asia, China most notably. And that does give us a very different world. It gives us a world where there's possibilities of getting lower cost goods, but potentially at higher environmental burden. And how we balance that has not yet, I think, been really thought through or carefully optimized. I think we're also in an era of extraordinary opportunity from a point of view of science and analysis. And I think we have underappreciated how much that needs to underpin our environmental frameworks. So I'm excited about the scientific breakthroughs that are coming, the nanoparticle revolutions that Alex is working on and that others are thinking about. I think there are, of course, challenges, serious challenges about how we manage these breakthroughs, but also huge opportunities. Opportunities I hope will be brought to bear to promote sustainability. And of course, I think there are now in the 21st century some overarching, we could even call them existential challenges that we did not focus on in the 20th century. And climate change leaps to mind. This is a battle for the future of the planet. I am not one to be fear-mongering. I don't think it has to be solved this week, this month, this year, even though it's a big year from a climate change point of view. But I do think we need to, over the next decade or two, really transform our energy future in particular, so as to ensure that we are maintaining a planet that is manageable from a habitat and ecosystem point of view. And I think there is an interesting transition from a perspective of the 20th century that retains some bite in the 21st, which viewed business as the enemy of the environment, to a world where we recognize that there are some inherent challenges in capitalism. There are some inherent complexities to the growth paradigm that underpins a private market economy. And yet, it is that private market economy that's a huge engine of innovation. And I think we need to think hard about how we address those complexities, some would call them inconsistencies, of the dynamic of capitalism with the enormous potential for private industry delivering solutions and helping be at the forefront of the innovation that I believe is the centerpiece of 21st century sustainability success. So I think, again, one of the core elements of the new vision is thinking about how we harness the private sector, harness the world of private business to sustainability goals, rather than beating up the business world as the problem and just a problem. And I do believe that there is tremendous entrepreneurial capacity, creative energy, and real spirit to deliver on the promise of a better society that is in the business world if its energies and creative spirit can be channeled by smart public policy. So that leads me to a quick run-through of what I would call the from-to analysis, arguing that we've come from the world of the 20th century that has certain defining features and headed toward a world of the 21st century that is going to have some quite different underpinnings and starting points. So let me start with some things I've already mentioned. First, I think we got going on environmental protection in the late 60s and into the 1970s on a media-specific basis. Air pollution identified and worked on over here, water pollution over there, chemical exposure over here. Today, we need an integrated approach and need to understand the connections and linkages and trade-offs as we address multiple problems in a simultaneous way. And the most fundamental integration required is this energy and environment connection, and I would argue it's actually with the economy as well. So energy, the environment, and the economy, I think, are deeply intertwined and deeply linked challenges. A second presumption of the 20th century that I think has to be rethought for the 21st is where the leadership would come from. I think people assumed in the 20th century the federal government would lead the charge. And I increasingly believe that states and even municipalities are doing some of the most creative work to help reframe what sustainability is going to look like. And I think we are going to see a much more decentralized focus on environmental protection in the coming decades, as we do see this broader structure of leadership emerge. Number three, I already mentioned, we're moving from a command and control regulatory framework to one that is much more centered on market mechanisms, economic incentives, including engaging of all of us in our purchasing decisions and our consuming practices as part of a decision process for things like eco-labels that will give us information on which products are to be preferred, and trying to harness people's environmental interests, not just as voters or citizens, but as consumers. Fourth, and I think, again, one of the most important transformations is that it was good enough in the 20th century to be qualitatively correct about the direction we needed to go for environmental protection. In the 21st century, you need to be quantitative and quantitatively correct. You need to have data and metrics and indicators. You need to know whether standards should be tightened 2% or 10% or 100%. And that requires, again, a much deeper integration of science, data, and risk analysis, and for that matter, benefit cost analysis into our regulatory program. I think we also need to, in addition to recognizing business as the critical point of leverage for progress and not government, do much more to promote green business. And this is an area that I've spent a lot of my career on. The whole Green to Gold book and its sequel tries to lay out the story as to why, from a business point of view, paying attention to energy, the environment, sustainability factors will increasingly be a critical factor in marketplace success, in sales growth and profitability, in customer loyalty, in the ability to attract and retain the very best workers. So I think we are seeing a transformation of business attitudes towards the environment, as well as what I'm calling for, which is a transformation of environmental attitudes toward business. Both ways, that process and relationship has to change. Another element of the 20th century, now to become the 21st century model, I believe in the 20th century, we focused far too much on targets, setting a goal, adopting a treaty, passing legislation, writing regulations, and not on implementation. The 21st century has to be about on-the-ground change. And this is where, again, I'm excited about 4 different departments sponsoring this talk, because implementation is going to require the engineers and not just the policymakers. It's going to require the sanitation department and not just the lawyers in the regulatory agency. It's going to require a wider range of people to play on the delivery, on the promise of the targets, on the legislation or the regulations or the treaty. But I think the 21st century is about implementation and not simply target setting. And in that regard, we had much too great a focus in the 20th century on inputs as the measure of success. How many laws got passed? How many employees work for the Environment Agency? How much money is in the budget for the EPA or the State Department of Environmental Conservation? In the 21st century, we're going to have an output focus. Is the water cleaner? Is the air better? Are we reducing exposure to chemicals? Are we protecting the ozone layer? Is it coming back? Are we reducing our exposure to climate change? Quantitative measures of atmospheric conditions, on the ground environmental or ambient conditions as the measure of success, not inputs. I think in this regard, we also had a challenge in the 20th century where we did a lot of things by permitting, literally by handing people permits in terms of a certain level of pollution. I think that model cannot be sustained. I say give people no right to pollute for free, no permits. Everything should be on a charge basis. All harm has a price on it. So I think we have to shift from an environmental permit framework to an environmental harm charge framework, where we actually make people pay for their environmental burdens on society. That's going to be complicated to implement, challenging politically, but I think fundamental to a 21st century strategy of sustainability. And I think building on those elements, I want to now talk a little bit about the core themes of my 21st century strategy, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I tried to begin the process of moving this agenda forward during my time in state government over the past 3 years. So here are my 4 core components of this 21st century picture of sustainability that moves beyond our 20th century model of environmental protection. Number 1, as you already heard, and I want to repeat one more time, is integration, a systems approach, understanding energy, the environment, the economy as integrated issues, air, water, waste, chemicals, as part of a whole that has to be managed in a combined way. That means more attention to multiple layers of government activity, not just the federal government, but states and municipalities. And not just the government, but what is the private sector doing? What are community groups doing? And it requires some new tools, like life cycle analysis. We need to understand not just the burden of making something, but what is going to happen to that product in its use out over time, and then in particular, what happens to it at the end of life. And this is, again, where design questions, materials questions are going to come to the fore in a way that we are underappreciated for the last 50 years, but will be at the heart of the sustainability challenge over the next 50. I think we need to understand that the innovation that's required has to be broadly conceived. It's not just about technology development. It is about new ways to finance environmental infrastructure, new ways to promote clean energy with investments in energy efficiency and renewable power. It needs to be about new ways to structure policy, to use limited government money to leverage private capital into those needed investments in energy, clean energy, or environmental infrastructure. It's going to require a new structure of public engagement on environmental issues. I mentioned already the need to get all of us as consumers to play an environmental role in thinking about how we buy and what we buy, and whether we're factoring in environmental considerations. And it's going to require new partnerships, because I think the government is not capable alone of doing the job anymore. And I'll pick just one area to give you an example: land conservation. In the past, people counted on the government to do parks. In the future, it's going to be land trusts, increasingly public-private partnerships that are going to be acquiring the open space that we want to preserve, because in so many places and ways it defines the communities we live in. So public-private partnerships, community-scale combinations of resources to get done what the government can no longer do on its own. So integration is agenda item number 1. Innovation, broadly conceived, as agenda item number 2, or theme number 2. A new structure of incentives, really focusing on incentives, how you change behavior, because it's behavior that's the critical transformation from target to implementation. So we really need to understand what are the incentives to deliver on the goals that have been set. And that does mean, I think, reimagining the role of government and really rethinking how we draw people in, not just businesses, but all of us as consumers and as citizens, into doing the work of sustainability. And I think information is one of the tools that will be available. We need to have much clearer real-time feedback on what's working, what's not, which problems are getting better, which are not. And that's why I believe that data and metrics are going to be so critical. But it also requires us to, fundamentally ask, what is the government's role here? How do we get a more effective outcome, recognizing the limits of government in terms of staffing, budgets, and what it can do? And I'll come back to that in a little while. 4th core theme I've already mentioned, but I want to stress again, and that is implementation. It is not good enough to coast once you got the legislation adopted. You have to ask, how do we implement it? No business would think that writing a business plan was the end of its job, or setting a mission statement out, which is what government basically did in the environmental arena. We did the business plan, and then we didn't execute. So implementation, or what businesses would call execution, is the core challenge of the 21st century. And in that regard, one of the other new elements is that costs matter. Everything is a trade-off. There is huge public support for environmental protection, but not at unlimited cost. And one of the keys to success is to not have environmental progress come at the price of other things people care about. So if it is a choice of economic growth and having a job or protecting the environment, the job and economic growth will win almost every time. Now, I am sure, I don't know where the dean or the provost are, but there is a small core of dedicated Stony Brook students that will say, we don't care, we want the environment protected. But 90% plus of the American people do care and trade these things off, and you must figure out how not to impede environmental progress by pitting it against economic success and middle-class security in terms of economic possibility. And that, I believe, is the core of the 21st century challenge for society broadly, is middle-class insecurity and economic dislocation. So we need to recast environmental protection as reinforcing and moving forward with economic success. So I think we've got lots of opportunities now to move forward on this agenda. And I want to just talk for a couple of minutes about how I tried to push this agenda forward in Connecticut as the head of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. So I was head of a department called DEEP, D-E-E-P, but I would say every day, and joke, but not really, that we should spell DEEP with 3 E's. Energy, the environment, and the economy had to be the integrated agenda. And I think that is, in fact, fundamental to 21st century success. And I say that, and I know many of you in this audience are in the environmental arena or studying sustainability, so you will know that our energy choices and related transportation choices are fundamental drivers of the pollution challenges we face. So I would argue that one of the biggest opportunities and challenges of the 21st century is to transform our energy future toward a future that is much cleaner, but hopefully also cheaper. And I want to come back to that in a minute. I think as well there is a need to reestablish an agenda for progress that can be bipartisan. I believe that as long as the environment is a democratic issue and Republicans feel themselves having to be hostile to whatever is being proposed, we are in deep trouble. And by the way, it was not that long ago this was a bipartisan issue. The environment agenda, in fact, originally was a Republican agenda. It was Teddy Roosevelt who really launched us 110 years ago on this path. And there is no reason why it cannot be reestablished, except that as long as people want to play politics with this issue, it will be troubled. So one of the things I'm proudest of in what I did in Connecticut was that the legislation creating this new Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, the programs I'm going to describe, the Green Bank that you heard about that I will talk about a little bit further, all put through the state legislature by near unanimous bipartisan majorities. The big bill that we advanced in 2011 that did most of this had not a single vote against it in our state Senate. Every Republican as well as every Democrat voting yes. And in the state House of Representatives, 5 people voted no out of 151. And 3 of them later told me they meant to vote yes. It's late at night, hard to know what button to press, that kind of thing. But it is the case that this agenda can be framed in ways that are going to be bipartisan. And let me start by giving a few examples. I talk a lot about clean energy, not climate change. Climate change has become too partisan divided. Clean energy is not. Everybody wants clean energy, particularly when the energy agenda I said we needed to have in Connecticut was an energy future that was cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable. Not many people are opposed to that. So if you are pursuing an energy agenda that has a frame to it that is bipartisan, you're going to go a lot farther. And this is fundamental to political success and something that I think we have underappreciated. But if you jam your agenda through the legislature on a partisan basis, it will almost certainly fail. And here's why. Anything big and transformative and society shifting is going to be somewhat screwed up. You just can't get it right in the first instance. And if we needed evidence of that, Obamacare has provided the most recent example. So no matter how important the transformation, you won't get it right the first time. So if you jammed it through, then 2 years down the line, the other side is going to say, oh no, you jammed that on us. You own all those problems, and we're going to start holding oversight hearings and call out the problems and find reports and put up media advisories about all the crazy things and screwed up things. If you did it on a bipartisan basis, everybody has ownership, and they say, oh, of course we want to fix it with you. So in Connecticut, I had to have a second big legislative bill put through in 2013 that fixed the dozens of problems that I had put forward in 2011. And I mean not a few, dozens of problems, things that we had just got wrong. But it went through on a totally bipartisan basis again, because I had the Republicans as well as the Democrats bought into a transformed agenda. So I do think bipartisanship is critical to success on the ground. And again, my most important virtue for the 21st century is implementation, measuring success in terms of on-the-ground environmental conditions. Now, I think there are a couple of examples of what I did in Connecticut I want to talk about, and then we'll open the conversation up. You heard already, but I want to give you a little bit more detail on the transformation of environmental regulation. Now, Connecticut had a reputation, as does New York, by the way, of being very burdensome from an environmental regulatory point of view. And not just companies complained. Mayors, first selectmen, local officials, all kinds of people felt the environmental regulatory framework just didn't work. And the governor, when he offered me the job, said, Dan, I'm giving you out of my 20 departments the most screwed up, the one that has the most complaints about it. I said, really? Worse than the DMV? He said, yes, worse than the DMV. And I said, that seems tough, but I'll take it on as a challenge. So here's what I did. I re-engineered every one of the 29 permitting programs of that department. Every single one using a lean strategy taken from the business world. And lean is a term of art where you take apart a system, piece by piece, map it out on the wall, literally all, 129 steps, using Post-it notes to write up what each step and who has to do what is. And then you ask a question, which of these steps are value added and which are not value added? And because it's government, you have a third category, no value added but required by law. And then you redo the process, trying to peel off the wall everything that's not value added. And we completely changed how permits got done. We also committed, and the governor, despite a budget crisis, was very supportive of this, to giving the people that had to manage these programs the resources to do it, particularly the information technology resources. And we completely changed how permitting gets done. I'll give you just one example. When I arrived at this Department of Environmental Protection, it took 14 months to get a permit to replace a dock. And like you all here, Connecticut has a big coastline, lots of docks, lots of lakes, lots of docks, and people were furious that simply replacing a dock required such a long permitting program, such a big wait, so many back and forth dialogues with the Department of Environmental Protection. So I said in my first day in the job, 14 months is crazy. I want a permitting program that takes 14 days. And everyone mocked me. Oh, come on. No, we've always done it this way. It has to be done this way. I said, no, it doesn't have to be done this way. Change is good. If you want the public to support your environmental program, you need to understand the public does not want 14-month permitting programs. So I said, all you dock permitting people, you're going off for 2 weeks and redoing your permitting. And they came back with a program that takes 1 day. 1 day. That's for a rebuild. Now, if you want to extend your dock or widen your dock or drive it through a wetlands, you're going to have a longer process. But the simple stuff can be done fast and easy, and now it takes a day. And let me tell you, nothing is more signaling of transformation than the fact that the most common permit that gets asked for now takes 1 day. And it means that the rest of the agenda, people will say, you know what, I think these guys have got a corner turned. I'm actually confident that they're on the right track. Hugely important. Second thing we did was to transform the energy agenda of the state, starting with the fact that Connecticut didn't have an energy program until we created this department. And energy was scattered all around. We basically thought it was a federal government job, but the federal government's not doing the job, so we figured we better, as the state, take it up. And we did. We created a comprehensive energy strategy with this focus on cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable energy. And it was an integrated strategy, had elements around energy efficiency, renewable power, providing more choice to consumers with wider access to natural gas, which is important because that looks to be the cheapest, cleanest, most reliable energy source out over the next couple of decades. A transportation agenda integrated with the energy agenda, particular focus on giving people choice in terms of alternative fuels. So fueling stations for natural gas, which is a good vehicle choice for some. Electric vehicle charging stations spread across the state. Connecticut is now the first state in the country to put an end to what's known as range anxiety. You don't have to worry if you have an electric car, you're going to run out of power, and therefore you shouldn't buy one. So an integrated strategy, again, focused on innovation, broadly considered. And we realize that one of the critical challenges in energy is not the need for new technology, it's the need to deploy technology. And that's why we set up this Green Bank, which is about innovative funding for clean energy in all of its forms. And that has proven to be hugely successful. It's allowed limited government money to be used to leverage private capital, ramped up the flow of resources to renewable energy projects in state by tenfold. That's not 10%, that's not 100%, that's 10 times as large an amount of renewable energy deployment. 5 times more energy efficiency projects. Because the government will never have enough money. So you need to make it attractive to private parties to put the money forward. And that requires, by the way, some clever policy. It's not by accident. It required a sustained focus on de-risking the flow of private capital into these projects. And that meant doing things like reducing the red tape, taking out what we call the soft costs of doing a rooftop solar array or redoing a building for energy efficiency. It meant using reverse auctions to pick projects as opposed to the government trying to pick winners, which has been the strategy of clean energy more broadly. And by the way, the federal government has demonstrated that it's not very good at picking industries, technologies, or companies to give subsidies to. So we shifted away from subsidies to finance. And again, that's what the Green Bank does. But some of you will probably know that the government has bet $20 billion on a single clean energy alternative fuel source that was meant to give us the clean energy future we needed. What is that $20 billion bet the federal government has placed over the last 15 years? Anyone know? I think I heard it. Corn-based ethanol. And you just heard me say I don't want to pick winners, but I am willing to pick a loser. Corn-based ethanol is a disaster. Creates a food-fuel trade-off. You know, we bid up the price of corn, and when you bid up the price of corn to flow some of it into ethanol, you bid up the price of everything that has corn in it. Hamburgers, chicken, you know, almost all of our food has some corn element to it. So this has proven to be a terrible, terrible strategy. So I think the truth of the matter is there is great opportunity to transform how we finance things, what incentives we use, what policy frameworks we approach things with. In Connecticut, we also transformed how we engage the public on clean energy with a Solarize program that helped convince people that putting a solar array on the roof was not crazy. And what we discovered was the single most important factor in whether people considered having solar power a possibility or something worth considering was if someone on their street had it. Because now it seemed normal. Now it seemed like something that people like them did, as opposed to something that flaky green people, you know, in Vermont do. And so we had to convince people this was a regular thing to consider. And this Solarize program has transformed how we market clean energy in the state of Connecticut. So I think I'm going to close by saying that I think there is equally an important opportunity to transform how the private sector approaches environment challenges, energy challenges. And I'll pick one other Connecticut example in this regard, General Electric. Jeff Immelt, the CEO there, has had a huge investment in his Eco-Imagination campaign, trying to reframe how he sells products around sustainability. Now, why has he done that? Some people say, well, maybe he's a Boy Scout and wants to be a good guy. Not at all. It's because he sees framing things with the sustainability benefits more clear is a way to grow his businesses, improve his margins, improve the profitability of his company. And so he is selling jet engines on their fuel efficiency. He's taking his engine technology and putting it into wind turbines to create a clean fuel alternative, a power generation alternative. He understands that sustainability is a mega trend for business, and there is an imperative to bring it into the strategy of almost every business. And I think we are seeing sustainability serve in the business world as a spur to innovation. So I will close by saying that I think we are ready for a 21st century approach to sustainability that integrates energy, environment, and the economy. We are ready for an innovation-focused strategy for protecting our planet and our country and our communities. We understand that the key to success is incentives that change behavior, and that we need to focus on implementation. So with that, I'd be happy to take some questions.